The morning sun barely touched the stone walls of Windsor Castle when Guard Lieutenant James Patterson received the most unusual order of his 15-year military career. Standing at attention in the corridor outside the royal apartments, he watched as Queen Camilla emerged from her private chambers, her expression tight with barely concealed anger. She didn't even glance in his direction as she swept past, her silk morning gown rustling against the ancient floors. What James didn't know was that this moment would change everything he thought he understood about duty, honor, and the true nature of royalty. James had joined the Queen's Guard straight out of military academy, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. The Patterson family had served the crown for 3 generations, and James wore his uniform with the same pride his ancestors had shown. He was known among his fellow guards as someone who followed orders without question, who stood his post in rain or shine, and who never, ever broke protocol. His commanding officers praised his discipline. His fellow guards respected his unwavering commitment. Even the senior royals knew his name, which was rare for someone in his position. That particular Tuesday morning had started like any other. James had arrived at the castle before dawn, gone through the standard security briefings, and taken his position outside the Queen Consort's quarters. He had been standing there for nearly 2 hours when he first noticed something was wrong. Raised voices echoed from behind the heavy oak doors, muffled but unmistakable. He recognized Queen Camilla's voice, sharp and insistent. The other voice was quieter, more measured, but James could hear the tension in every word. The argument seemed to be about a charity event scheduled for later that week. James couldn't make out all the details, but he heard mentions of guest lists, seating arrangements, and someone named Margaret who apparently wasn't supposed to be invited. The voices grew louder, then suddenly stopped. A heavy silence fell over the corridor, the kind that makes even the most seasoned guard shift uncomfortably. James kept his eyes straight ahead, his face carefully neutral, exactly as he had been trained to do. Minutes later, the door swung open with such force that it startled even James, though he managed to maintain his composure. Queen Camilla stepped out, her face flushed with anger. Behind her, Lady Sarah Mitchell, one of her senior aides, emerged looking pale and shaken. The Queen stopped directly in front of James, so close he could see the fury burning in her eyes. For a moment she simply stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time despite his weeks of standing guard at her door. Then came the words that would set everything in motion. The Queen's voice was cold, clipped, each word delivered like a small explosion in the quiet corridor. She told him there was a guard who had apparently been gossiping about private royal matters. She said this guard had violated the sacred trust placed in everyone who served the royal household. She demanded that James personally escort this guard off the premises immediately, making sure he understood he would never work in any royal capacity again. The disgraced guard's name, she said, was Thomas Whitmore. James felt his stomach drop. Thomas Whitmore wasn't just any guard. He was James's closest friend in the service, the man who had helped James through his difficult first year, who had been the best man at James's wedding just 6 months ago. They had served together for 12 years, had watched each other's backs through countless long shifts and challenging situations. James knew Thomas as well as he knew his own brother, and he knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would never gossip about the royals. It went against everything Thomas believed in, everything he had dedicated his life to. For the first time in his career, James hesitated. The pause was barely noticeable, perhaps a second or two, but Queen Camilla caught it immediately. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. She asked if there was a problem, her tone suggesting there had better not be. James quickly shook his head and said he would handle it right away. But inside his mind was racing. Something about this entire situation felt wrong. Why would Thomas suddenly start gossiping after 12 years of impeccable service? Why had James never heard any rumors or complaints about Thomas before this moment? And why did Queen Camilla seem so personally invested in having Thomas removed immediately? As Queen Camilla turned to leave, she delivered one final instruction that made James's blood run cold. She told him to make sure Thomas was escorted out through the service entrance, away from public view. She didn't want any scene, any publicity, anything that might draw attention. Thomas was to be gone within the hour, and if James valued his own position, he would make certain of it. Then she swept away down the corridor, Lady Sarah hurrying to keep up with her, leaving James standing alone with the weight of an impossible order pressing down on his shoulders. James stood there for several long moments, his training warring with his instincts. Everything he had been taught told him to follow orders without question. The Queen Consort had given him a direct command, and his duty was to carry it out immediately. But something deeper, some sense of justice that his father had instilled in him along with the family tradition of service, told him to pause, to think, to question whether blind obedience was always the same thing as doing what was right. He thought about Thomas's wife, Emma, who was 7 months pregnant with their first child. He thought about the modest house Thomas had finally saved enough to buy, the mortgage payments that depended on his steady palace income. He thought about how Thomas had once told him that serving the crown was the greatest honor of his life, that he would rather die than bring shame to the uniform he wore. And James knew in that moment that he couldn't simply follow this order without understanding what was really happening. He needed to talk to Thomas first. He needed to hear his friend's side of the story. He needed to know the truth before he destroyed a good man's life and career. Making his decision, James straightened his shoulders and headed toward the east wing, where he knew Thomas would be finishing his morning shift. With each step, he felt the weight of what he was about to do. He wasn't defying a direct order, not yet. He was simply gathering information before carrying it out. But even that small act of independent thinking felt like stepping off a cliff, entering territory he had never explored in all his years of service. He had no idea that this simple decision to seek the truth would lead him down a path that would expose secrets, challenge his understanding of loyalty, and ultimately force him to choose between the orders he had been given and the principles he had always believed in. James found Thomas exactly where he expected, standing at his post near the historic portrait gallery. His friend looked tired but alert, his uniform pressed to perfection as always. When Thomas saw James approaching with an unusual urgency in his step, his expression shifted from friendly greeting to concern. The two men had known each other long enough that Thomas immediately sensed something was wrong. He asked James what had happened, keeping his voice low as 2 palace staff members passed by carrying fresh flower arrangements for the day's events. James pulled Thomas aside into an empty alcove, away from the main corridor traffic. He spoke quickly but quietly, explaining what Queen Camilla had told him. As James repeated the accusation about gossiping, he watched Thomas's face carefully. What he saw there wasn't guilt or shame or even fear. It was pure confusion, followed rapidly by shock and then anger. Thomas insisted he hadn't gossiped about anyone, let alone the royal family. He said he had no idea what the Queen Consort was talking about. His voice rose slightly with frustration, and James had to remind him to keep quiet. Thomas ran his hand through his hair, a gesture James recognized as his friend's way of processing stress. He told James that the only unusual thing that had happened recently was 3 days ago, when he had been standing guard outside a small sitting room during a private meeting. He explained that Lady Sarah Mitchell had been meeting with someone, and he had heard raised voices. One voice belonged to Lady Sarah, and the other was a woman he didn't recognize. The conversation had been heated with mentions of money, photographs, and someone needing to be kept quiet. Thomas admitted he had found it strange but had done exactly what he was supposed to do, which was ignore it and maintain his post. As Thomas spoke, James felt puzzle pieces beginning to click together in his mind. Lady Sarah Mitchell had been the one in Queen Camilla's chambers this morning, the one who had emerged looking pale and shaken after the argument. Lady Sarah was also the person Queen Camilla trusted most with sensitive matters, including guest lists and private arrangements. James asked Thomas if he had mentioned overhearing that conversation to anyone at all. Thomas shook his head firmly. He said he had learned long ago that palace guards who wanted to keep their jobs didn't talk about what they heard or saw, ever, not even to other guards. James believed him. Not just because Thomas was his friend, but because everything about his body language, his tone, his immediate reaction to the accusation spoke of genuine innocence. Whatever was happening here, Thomas wasn't guilty of gossiping. But someone wanted him gone, and they wanted him gone quickly and quietly. The question was why. James thought about the timeline. Thomas had overheard that suspicious conversation 3 days ago. This morning, Queen Camilla had argued with Lady Sarah. Now suddenly Thomas was being accused of gossiping and needed to be escorted out within the hour. The connections were there, but James couldn't quite see the full picture yet. Thomas asked James what he was going to do. The question hung heavy in the air between them. James had his orders, clear and direct, from Queen Camilla herself. He was supposed to escort Thomas out immediately. No questions asked, no investigation needed. That was how things worked in the palace. The royals gave orders and the guards carried them out. It was a system that had functioned for centuries, built on trust and unquestioning loyalty. But James found himself questioning everything now. Could he really destroy his friend's career, his reputation, his livelihood, based on an accusation that seemed to come out of nowhere? James told Thomas to stay at his post and act normal. He said he needed to think, to figure out what was really happening before he did anything. Thomas looked both relieved and worried. He warned James to be careful, reminding him that going against the Queen Consort's direct orders could end both their careers. James knew his friend was right. What he was considering wasn't just risky, it was potentially career suicide. But he also knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try to understand the truth. His father had always told him that a man's honor wasn't defined by blind obedience, but by doing what was right, even when it was difficult. After leaving Thomas, James made his way to the security office, a small room tucked away in the castle's lower level, where all the guard schedules and duty logs were kept. The officer on duty, an older guard named Roberts, who was months away from retirement, greeted James with his usual friendly nod. James asked if he could review the duty logs from the past week, claiming he needed to verify some scheduling information for his report. Roberts didn't question it and handed over the logbook before returning to his paperback novel and afternoon tea. James flipped through the pages until he found the entries from 3 days ago. There it was in Thomas's neat handwriting, noting his assignment to the sitting room corridor and the duration of his shift. James then checked the appointment calendar, which listed all scheduled meetings and events. The sitting room had been reserved for Lady Sarah Mitchell for a private meeting. Duration 2 hours, no other details listed. This wasn't unusual. Senior royal staff often held private meetings about sensitive matters. What was unusual was what James discovered next. As he continued reading through the logs, James noticed that later that same evening, there had been an unscheduled visitor cleared through security. The visitor's name was listed as Margaret Thornton, and her purpose of visit was marked simply as personal business with Lady Sarah Mitchell. James felt his pulse quicken. Margaret. That was the name he had heard Queen Camilla mention during her argument this morning. The woman who apparently wasn't supposed to be invited to the charity event. The pieces were coming together now, but the picture they formed was deeply troubling. James quickly made notes of the relevant information, being careful not to write anything that could be traced back to him. He thanked Roberts and left the security office, his mind racing. He now had evidence that Thomas's story checked out. There had been a meeting. Lady Sarah had met with someone, and that someone was possibly connected to whatever was causing tension between Lady Sarah and Queen Camilla. But James still didn't understand what any of it meant or why Thomas was being blamed for something he hadn't done. He needed more information, but he also needed to be smart about how he got it. James couldn't just start asking questions around the palace. That would draw attention, and attention was the last thing he needed right now. He had maybe 30 minutes before Queen Camilla would expect to hear that Thomas had been escorted out. If James wanted to help his friend and uncover the truth, he needed to act fast and carefully. One wrong move could end both their careers and possibly get them into much more serious trouble than they could imagine. James decided his next step had to be finding out who Margaret Thornton was and why her potential attendance at a charity event would cause such a strong reaction from Queen Camilla. He made his way to the palace library, a quiet space where staff members could access newspapers, public records, and other resources. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, had worked at the palace for 30 years and knew where to find information on just about anything. James asked her if she could help him locate any news articles or public information about someone named Margaret Thornton, saying it was for background research on potential charity event attendees. Mrs. Chen's expression changed the moment James mentioned the name. She asked him why he wanted to know about Margaret Thornton, her tone suggesting she knew exactly who the woman was. James kept his explanation vague but professional, sticking to his story about charity event research. After a long moment of consideration, Mrs. Chen told him to wait and disappeared into the back section of the library. She returned 10 minutes later with a folder containing newspaper clippings from various London papers, all dating back about 8 years. What James read in those articles made everything suddenly, terribly clear, and he realized that he and Thomas had stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than a simple misunderstanding about gossiping. The newspaper articles told a story James had never heard before, one that had apparently been kept very quiet at the time. 8 years ago, Margaret Thornton had worked as a senior aide to Queen Camilla, back when Camilla was still the Duchess of Cornwall. According to the articles, Margaret had left her position suddenly and under mysterious circumstances. The official statement said she was pursuing other opportunities, but several journalists had questioned the timing and the speed of her departure. One article suggested there had been some kind of disagreement about how certain charitable funds were being managed, but nothing was ever proven or formally investigated. What caught James's attention most was a small piece buried in one of the longer articles. It mentioned that Margaret Thornton had signed a confidentiality agreement as part of her departure, which was unusual for palace staff at her level. The article speculated that she had been paid a settlement to ensure her silence about something, but again, no details were ever made public. After that flurry of media attention, Margaret Thornton had disappeared from public view entirely, until 3 days ago when she had shown up at Windsor Castle for a private meeting with Lady Sarah Mitchell. James thanked Mrs. Chen and left the library with his mind spinning. The picture was becoming clearer now, and it wasn't pretty. Margaret Thornton had left Queen Camilla's service 8 years ago under suspicious circumstances and had been paid to stay quiet about something. Now she had suddenly reappeared, meeting with Lady Sarah Mitchell and apparently demanding something, based on what Thomas had overheard about money and photographs and keeping people quiet. Queen Camilla clearly didn't want Margaret at the charity event, which suggested she didn't want Margaret anywhere near her or the palace. And now Thomas, who had been standing guard during Margaret's meeting with Lady Sarah, was being accused of gossiping and ordered to be removed immediately. The conclusion was inescapable. Thomas wasn't being fired for gossiping. He was being removed because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had potentially overheard something that someone, probably Lady Sarah or Queen Camilla or both, didn't want anyone to know about. By accusing Thomas of gossiping and having him quietly escorted out, they could eliminate a potential witness before he had time to think about what he had heard or mention it to anyone. It was clever in a ruthless sort of way. No one would question the removal of a guard accused of breaking confidentiality, and Thomas would be too focused on trying to save his reputation to ask questions about why he had really been targeted. James felt anger rising in his chest. His friend was being used as a pawn in whatever game was being played here, his career and reputation being sacrificed to cover up something that had nothing to do with him. James thought about Emma, Thomas's pregnant wife, and the life they were building together. He thought about the years of loyal service Thomas had given to the crown, and he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't let this happen. Not without a fight. But fighting back against Queen Camilla was dangerous territory, something that could destroy James's own career and possibly much more. James checked his watch. He had been gone from his post for nearly 40 minutes. Queen Camilla would be expecting news that Thomas had been removed by now. James needed to make a decision, and he needed to make it fast. He could follow his orders, escort Thomas out, and forget everything he had learned. It would be the safe choice, the one that protected his career and his family's legacy of service. Or he could do something that terrified him but felt right in his bones. He could refuse to carry out the order until he had answers. Before he could second-guess himself, James made his way back to Queen Camilla's private quarters. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Every instinct he had developed over 15 years of service was screaming at him to turn around, to not do this incredibly foolish thing. But he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until he was standing outside the door where this had all started. He knocked firmly and waited, trying to keep his breathing steady. Lady Sarah Mitchell opened the door, her expression shifting from neutral to surprised when she saw James. She asked if he had completed his assignment, her tone making it clear she expected a simple yes. Instead, James asked if he could speak with Queen Camilla. Lady Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and she told him that wasn't how things were done. Guards didn't request audiences with members of the royal family. They followed orders and reported to their commanding officers. James stood his ground and repeated his request, adding that it concerned a matter of significant importance that the Queen Consort should know about before any action was taken regarding Guard Whitmore. For a long moment, Lady Sarah simply stared at him, her face pale. James could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, weighing risks and options. Finally, she told him to wait and close the door. James stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. When the door opened again, Queen Camilla herself stood there, her expression cold and dangerous. She asked James why he was still here, and why Guard Whitmore had not yet been removed from the premises. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it that made James's stomach clench with fear. James took a deep breath and spoke carefully, keeping his voice respectful but firm. He said he had concerns about the accusation against Guard Whitmore. He explained that he had reviewed the duty logs and found no evidence of any gossiping. He mentioned that Guard Whitmore had been at his post 3 days ago during a private meeting in the sitting room, and that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about his presence there. James deliberately didn't mention Margaret Thornton's name or the newspaper articles. He wanted to see how Queen Camilla would react to this limited information first. Queen Camilla's face changed color, shifting from pale to flushed. She told James that he was out of line, that he had no business questioning her orders or investigating matters that didn't concern him. She said his job was to follow orders, not to play detective. Lady Sarah appeared behind the Queen, looking worried now, and whispered something that James couldn't hear. Queen Camilla nodded curtly and then turned back to James. She said that if he valued his position and his family's legacy of service, he would forget everything he thought he knew and complete his assignment immediately. James felt his courage wavering. The threat was clear. Not just his job was at risk, but his entire family's reputation. The Pattersons had served the crown for generations with honor. What he was doing now could tarnish all of that. But then he thought about his father's words again, about honor meaning more than blind obedience. He thought about Thomas and Emma and their unborn child, and he found himself saying words he never imagined he would say to a member of the royal family. James told Queen Camilla that he couldn't carry out the order because it was based on false accusations. He said Guard Whitmore had done nothing wrong and didn't deserve to have his career destroyed. He added that if the Queen insisted on removing Guard Whitmore, James would have no choice but to report his concerns through official channels, which would require a formal investigation into the circumstances. It was the most politely worded act of defiance James had ever committed, and the moment the words left his mouth he knew there was no going back. The silence that followed was deafening. Queen Camilla stared at James with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was it anger, fear, calculation? Behind her, Lady Sarah looked like she might faint. Several long seconds passed, during which James was certain his career and possibly his freedom were about to end. Then Queen Camilla spoke, her voice so quiet James had to strain to hear it. She told him to come inside, that they needed to discuss this matter privately. She stepped back and gestured for him to enter her private chambers, something that had never happened in all his years of service. As James stepped across the threshold, he realized he was entering territory far beyond anything in his training or experience. He was no longer just a guard following orders. He was becoming a player in a game he barely understood, a game involving secrets and power and the complicated politics of palace life. Whatever happened next, James knew that his life and career would never be the same. He had made his choice, stood his ground, and now he would have to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The private sitting room James entered was smaller than he expected, decorated in soft blues and creams with antique furniture that probably cost more than James made in a decade. Queen Camilla gestured to a chair opposite a small tea table, and James sat stiffly, every muscle in his body tense. Lady Sarah remained standing near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The Queen sat down across from James and studied him for a long moment before speaking. She asked him how much he knew, her voice still cold but now tinged with something else that might have been resignation. James decided honesty was his only option at this point. He told her he knew that Margaret Thornton had worked for her years ago and had left under unusual circumstances. He knew that Margaret had met with Lady Sarah 3 days ago, and that Guard Whitmore had been on duty during that meeting. He said he believed Thomas was being accused of gossiping not because he had actually gossiped, but because someone wanted him removed before he could think too carefully about what he might have overheard. James left out the details about the newspaper articles and the confidentiality agreement, wanting to see how much Queen Camilla would volunteer on her own. Queen Camilla closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, she looked older somehow, more tired. She told James he was too clever for his own good, and that his loyalty to his friend, while admirable, was going to complicate an already difficult situation. Lady Sarah started to say something, but the Queen held up her hand to silence her. Then Queen Camilla began to explain, and what she said was both more and less shocking than James had imagined. 8 years ago, Margaret Thornton had indeed worked as one of Queen Camilla's senior aides. Margaret had been brilliant at her job, organized and discreet, exactly the type of person you wanted handling sensitive royal matters. But Margaret had also been ambitious in ways that eventually became problematic. She had started taking liberties, making decisions without approval, and handling certain charitable donations in ways that weren't technically illegal but weren't entirely appropriate either. When Queen Camilla had discovered what was happening, she had confronted Margaret, and Margaret had threatened to go to the press with what she called evidence of financial impropriety. The evidence, Queen Camilla explained, was a collection of photographs and documents that Margaret had carefully collected over her time in service. Taken individually, none of them showed anything truly scandalous, but presented together in the right way, twisted with the right narrative, they could create the appearance of financial mismanagement. It wouldn't have stood up to a serious investigation, but the damage to Queen Camilla's reputation would have been done before the truth could come out. So a settlement had been reached. Margaret received a substantial payment, signed a confidentiality agreement, and disappeared from public life. The matter had been closed, or so everyone thought. But 3 days ago, Margaret had contacted Lady Sarah requesting a private meeting. She claimed she needed money for medical expenses and suggested that perhaps the confidentiality agreement could be renegotiated for an additional payment. It was blackmail, pure and simple, though Margaret had been careful never to use that word. Lady Sarah had agreed to meet with her, hoping to handle the situation quietly without involving Queen Camilla. The meeting had not gone well. Margaret had made it clear she expected a significant sum of money and implied that she still had copies of those photographs and documents despite having supposedly destroyed them as part of the original agreement. Lady Sarah had panicked and told Queen Camilla what was happening. The charity event where Margaret's name had appeared on the guest list was because Margaret had managed to secure an invitation through a mutual acquaintance before Lady Sarah could prevent it. Queen Camilla had been furious, not just at Margaret's reappearance but at Lady Sarah for trying to handle it alone and making it worse. During their argument that morning, Queen Camilla had learned that Guard Whitmore had been on duty during Margaret's visit. The fear that he might have overheard something, combined with the stress of the entire situation, had led to the hasty decision to have him removed. James listened to all of this with growing understanding and sympathy. He could see now that Queen Camilla wasn't some villain trying to destroy an innocent man's life out of pure malice. She was someone in a difficult situation, making poor decisions out of fear and stress. That didn't make what she had tried to do to Thomas right, but it made it more understandable. James asked what Queen Camilla planned to do about Margaret. She shook her head and said she didn't know. Paying her again would only prove that blackmail worked, inviting more demands in the future. Refusing to pay risked Margaret going public with her twisted version of events. James surprised himself by saying that maybe there was another option, one that didn't involve paying blackmail or destroying Thomas's career. Both women looked at him with skepticism, and James admitted he wasn't entirely sure what that option was yet. But he said that sometimes the best way to deal with someone like Margaret was to take away their power. Margaret's power came from secrecy, from the threat of what she might reveal. What if they removed that threat somehow? Queen Camilla asked what he meant, and James found himself thinking out loud, piecing together an idea even as he spoke. James suggested that Queen Camilla could get ahead of Margaret's threats by proactively having the old financial records reviewed by an independent auditor. If the records showed that everything had been handled properly, which Queen Camilla insisted was the case, then Margaret's photographs and documents would be meaningless. The truth would be on record, verified by professionals before Margaret could present her twisted version. It would require Queen Camilla to be transparent about something she had worked hard to keep private, but it would also take away Margaret's leverage entirely. Lady Sarah immediately objected, saying that would invite exactly the kind of media scrutiny they were trying to avoid. But Queen Camilla looked thoughtful. She said that James might be right, that the fear of exposure had kept her trapped for 8 years, always waiting for Margaret to resurface with new demands. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid and simply tell the truth. The records would show that while Margaret had overstepped her authority in some ways, nothing illegal or truly improper had occurred. Yes, there would be some uncomfortable questions and media attention for a while, but it would pass, and more importantly, Margaret would have nothing left to threaten her with. James then addressed the matter of Thomas. He said that if Queen Camilla was willing to be transparent about the Margaret situation, she should also be transparent about why Thomas had been targeted. Not publicly, perhaps, but at least within the palace security structure. Thomas deserved to know why he had been falsely accused, and he deserved an apology. More than that, he deserved to keep his job and his reputation intact. Queen Camilla was quiet for a long moment, and James held his breath, waiting to see if he had pushed too far. Finally, Queen Camilla nodded slowly. She said James was right, that Thomas had done nothing wrong and shouldn't suffer for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She would speak with Thomas personally, explain the situation and apologize. She would also make it clear that his record would show no disciplinary action, and that his service was valued. As for James himself, Queen Camilla said his willingness to stand up for what was right, even at great personal risk, was exactly the kind of character the Royal Guard needed. His father and grandfather would be proud, though she hoped he would use slightly more conventional channels in the future when he had concerns about orders. Lady Sarah looked less convinced about the plan to go public with the audit, but she didn't argue further. Queen Camilla told her to contact their legal team and begin the process of arranging for an independent review of the charitable funds from that time period. She also instructed Lady Sarah to contact Margaret Thornton and inform her that there would be no additional payments, now or ever, and that if Margaret attempted to go public with her accusations, she would find that the palace had already released accurate information that contradicted her false narrative. As James stood to leave, Queen Camilla stopped him and thanked him. She said it took courage to do what he had done, and that sometimes the palace needed people who were willing to question orders when those orders were wrong. She admitted that fear and stress had led her to make a terrible decision about Thomas, and she was grateful that James had given her the chance to make it right before real harm was done. James nodded respectfully and left the room, his legs feeling weak now that the adrenaline was wearing off. He had just done the most terrifying thing in his career, and somehow, incredibly, it had worked out. But as James made his way back through the palace corridors, he knew the situation wasn't completely resolved yet. Margaret Thornton was still out there, and she wouldn't give up her leverage easily. The audit would take time to complete, and until then there was still a risk that Margaret might try something desperate. James needed to warn Thomas about what was coming, and make sure his friend understood that while the immediate danger had passed, they all needed to stay alert. The next few days would be critical, and James had a feeling this story wasn't. James found Thomas exactly where he had left him, still at his post but looking considerably more anxious than before. When Thomas saw James approaching, the relief on his face was visible even from a distance. James gestured for his friend to follow him to a more private area, and once they were alone, he explained everything that had happened. Thomas listened in stunned silence, his eyes growing wider with each revelation about Margaret Thornton, the blackmail attempt, and Queen Camilla's decision to have the records audited and clear both their names. When James finished, Thomas sank into a nearby chair and let out a long breath. He said he couldn't believe James had actually confronted Queen Camilla, that anyone with sense would have just followed orders and avoided the whole mess. But there was profound gratitude in his voice, and his eyes were bright with emotion. Thomas said James had saved his career, his reputation, and probably his marriage too, since he had been dreading telling Emma that he had been fired. James felt embarrassed by the praise and quickly changed the subject, warning Thomas that while the immediate crisis had passed, they both needed to be careful over the next few days. That afternoon, Queen Camilla kept her word and met with Thomas privately. James wasn't present for that conversation, but Thomas told him afterward that the Queen had been direct and honest about what had happened. She had apologized for allowing fear to cloud her judgment, and for putting Thomas in an impossible situation. She had assured him that his record would remain spotless and that she personally valued his continued service. Thomas said he had been too shocked to say much beyond thanking her, but he appreciated her willingness to admit she had made a mistake. It wasn't something you expected from royalty, and it made him respect her more, not less. Meanwhile, Lady Sarah contacted Margaret Thornton with Queen Camilla's message. The conversation, James later learned, had not gone well. Margaret had been furious, accusing them of breaking their agreement and threatening legal action. Lady Sarah had calmly explained that there was no agreement being broken, because Margaret herself had violated the original confidentiality agreement by attempting blackmail. Lady Sarah had then informed Margaret that an independent audit of the charitable funds was already being arranged, and that the results would be made public. Margaret could release whatever documents she wanted, but they would only show that her accusations were unfounded. For several days, nothing happened. James and Thomas returned to their regular duties, though both men remained alert for any sign of trouble. The palace legal team worked with an independent accounting firm to begin the audit process, which would take several weeks to complete. Queen Camilla went about her scheduled appearances and events, though James noticed she seemed more relaxed, as if a weight had been lifted. Lady Sarah, on the other hand, looked increasingly stressed, probably worried about what might happen if Margaret decided to retaliate before the audit results were ready. Then, 5 days after the confrontation in Queen Camilla's chambers, Margaret Thornton made her move. A tabloid newspaper published an exclusive story claiming they had been given documents showing financial irregularities in one of Queen Camilla's charitable foundations from years earlier. The article was carefully worded to avoid direct accusations of wrongdoing, but it raised questions and suggested there might be more to the story. The paper claimed their source had provided photographs of documents and emails that painted a concerning picture of how donations had been handled. The palace could have panicked at this point, but instead they were ready. Within hours of the article's publication, Queen Camilla's press secretary released a statement saying the palace had already commissioned an independent audit of the charitable funds in question. The statement explained that concerns had been raised about past management practices by a former employee, and out of an abundance of caution and commitment to transparency, the Queen Consort had requested a thorough review by a respected accounting firm. The statement promised that full results would be made public as soon as the audit was complete. The response was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of looking defensive or guilty, Queen Camilla appeared proactive and transparent. Other news outlets picked up the story, but the angle shifted from scandal to responsible governance. Several commentators praised the palace for being so forthcoming about reviewing old concerns rather than trying to hide them. The tabloid that had published Margaret's story found itself in the awkward position of having run what now looked like old news based on information the palace was already addressing. Their exclusive scoop had been effectively neutralized. Margaret tried to keep the story alive by providing more documents to other papers, but the impact was minimal. The narrative had already been set, and it wasn't the one Margaret had hoped for. Instead of a palace scrambling to cover up financial misdeeds, the public saw a royal household taking responsibility and ensuring everything was properly reviewed. When some outlets reached out to Margaret for further comment, she made increasingly wild accusations that only made her seem less credible. Several journalists began investigating Margaret's background and discovered the confidentiality agreement she had signed years earlier, which raised questions about her motives. 3 weeks after the audit began, the accounting firm released their preliminary findings. As Queen Camilla had known all along, the review showed that while there had been some administrative confusion during the time Margaret worked there, all funds had been properly handled and accounted for. The photographs and documents Margaret had provided to the press were real, but taken out of context, they created a misleading impression. The full picture showed a well-run charitable organization with appropriate oversight and controls. A few minor recommendations were made for improving documentation procedures, which the palace immediately agreed to implement. The media attention died down quickly after that. Margaret Thornton disappeared from public view again, this time likely for good. The palace legal team sent her a formal letter warning that any further attempts to make false accusations would result in legal action. Margaret had burned her bridges, lost her leverage, and gained nothing except perhaps the satisfaction of causing a few weeks of uncomfortable headlines. But those headlines had ultimately worked in Queen Camilla's favor, making her look transparent and responsible rather than secretive and corrupt. James watched all of this unfold with a mixture of relief and amazement. His decision to question his orders, to stand up for Thomas, and to suggest a different approach had set all of this in motion. He had been terrified at the time, certain he was destroying his career and his family's legacy. Instead, he had helped solve a problem that had been festering for 8 years. Queen Camilla had been freed from the constant fear of Margaret's threats. Thomas had kept his job and his reputation, and James had learned something important about the difference between following orders and doing what was right. A month after everything had settled down, James was called to a private meeting with the head of palace security. For a moment, his old fears returned. Maybe he was finally going to face consequences for his actions, delayed but inevitable. Instead, he was informed that he was being promoted to senior guard lieutenant, with additional responsibilities for training and mentoring younger guards. The promotion came with a letter of commendation from Queen Camilla herself, praising his integrity and judgment in handling a difficult situation. Thomas received recognition as well, a formal note in his personnel file commending his discretion and professionalism. More importantly for Thomas, he received a substantial raise that came just in time for Emma to take maternity leave. When their daughter was born 6 weeks later, Thomas and Emma asked James to be the godfather, an honor James accepted with deep emotion. He held the tiny baby girl in his arms at the christening and thought about how different things might have been if he had simply followed his orders that morning without question. James never forgot the lesson he learned during those tense days. Loyalty and duty were important, essential even, but blind obedience could sometimes lead to terrible injustices. True honor meant having the courage to question orders when those orders were wrong, even when questioning them put everything you valued at risk. His father had tried to teach him that, but James hadn't truly understood until he had been forced to make that choice himself. Now, as he trained new guards, he tried to pass on that same lesson, knowing that someday they too might face a moment when following orders and doing the right thing were not the same thing. The story of what had really happened that day remained mostly private, known only to a small circle of people within the palace. But those who knew treated James with a new level of respect, and he occasionally caught Queen Camilla giving him a slight nod when their paths crossed during her public appearances. It was a small acknowledgement of what they had been through together, a shared secret that had changed them both. For James, it was enough. He had done the right thing, protected his friend, and helped solve a problem that had troubled the royal household for years. And somehow, against all odds, he had survived to tell the tale. 2 years after the incident with Margaret Thornton, James Patterson stood in the same corridor where everything had begun, but his life looked completely different now. As senior guard lieutenant, he oversaw a team of 20 guards and was responsible for training all new recruits. His uniform now bore additional insignia showing his rank, and his opinion was sought by senior palace officials on security matters. But the changes went deeper than just his position. James had become known throughout the palace staff as someone who could be trusted to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. Thomas had also thrived in the 2 years since the crisis. His daughter, little Catherine, was now a cheerful toddler who occasionally visited the palace with Emma to meet her godfather during his lunch breaks. Thomas had been promoted to senior guard as well, and he and James often worked together planning security for major royal events. The bond between them had always been strong, but surviving that ordeal together had made it unbreakable. They rarely spoke about what had happened, but both men carried the memory of those tense days as a reminder of what really mattered. Queen Camilla had become more approachable and transparent in her dealings with palace staff since the Margaret incident. She had learned that hiding problems often made them worse, while facing them directly, though uncomfortable, usually led to better outcomes. She occasionally asked James for his perspective on security matters, trusting his judgment in ways that would have been unthinkable before. Their relationship remained formal and professional, but there was mutual respect there that hadn't existed before those difficult days. Lady Sarah Mitchell had also changed. She had resigned from her position 6 months after the incident, saying she wanted to spend more time with her family, but James suspected the stress of the Margaret situation had taken its toll. Lady Sarah had tried to handle something she wasn't equipped to manage, and it had nearly destroyed several people's careers and reputations. Her replacement, a former diplomat named Elizabeth Chen, brought a more measured approach to problem-solving and insisted on keeping Queen Camilla informed of all potential issues, no matter how small. The palace ran more smoothly under her management. As for Margaret Thornton, she had vanished completely from public view after the audit vindicated Queen Camilla. James had heard through palace sources that Margaret had moved abroad, possibly to Spain or Portugal, and was living quietly on what remained of her original settlement. The newspapers that had initially published her accusations had moved on to other stories, and Margaret's brief moment of attempted revenge had been largely forgotten by everyone except those directly involved. Sometimes James wondered if she regretted her actions or if she still believed she had been wronged. He would never know the answer. On a crisp autumn morning, James was conducting a training session with 3 new recruits in the palace courtyard. He was teaching them about the importance of observation and discretion, skills that went beyond the obvious security aspects of their jobs. One of the recruits, a young woman named Sarah Davies, asked a question that made James pause. She wanted to know what a guard should do if they were given an order that seemed wrong or unjust. The other trainers might have told her to simply follow orders and trust that her superiors knew best. But James had learned better. James thought carefully about his answer before speaking. He told the recruits that their first duty was always to the crown and to the safety of those they protected. But he said there might be rare occasions when following an order without question would actually harm those they were meant to serve. In those moments, they had a responsibility to speak up, to ask questions, and to make sure they understood the full situation before acting. He emphasized that this didn't mean disobeying orders casually or thinking they knew better than their commanding officers. It meant having the courage to voice legitimate concerns through proper channels. Sarah asked how they would know the difference between a difficult order and a wrong order. James smiled at the question because it was exactly the right one to ask. He told her there was no easy answer, that each situation would be different, and that they would have to trust their judgment and their conscience. But he said that if an order would harm an innocent person, if it was based on false information, or if it seemed designed to cover up wrongdoing rather than prevent it, those were signs they should question what they were being asked to do. He added that questioning didn't always mean refusing. Sometimes it just meant seeking clarity before acting. The recruits listened intently, and James could see them processing this information that probably contradicted much of what they had been taught in their initial training. Military discipline required obedience, but palace service sometimes required judgment that went beyond simple rule following. James wanted these young guards to understand that they were not just uniformed robots, but thinking individuals who might someday face situations where the right choice wasn't obvious. He wanted them to be prepared for those moments instead of blindsided by them the way he had been. After the training session ended, Thomas joined James for their usual coffee break. They sat on a bench overlooking the palace gardens, watching tourists gather near the gates for the changing of the guard ceremony. Thomas mentioned that Emma was pregnant again, due in the spring, and they were hoping for a boy this time, though they would be happy either way. James congratulated his friend warmly and asked if Thomas would want him to be godfather again. Thomas laughed and said that went without saying, that Catherine was already asking when Uncle James would come visit again. As they talked, James reflected on how different his life might have been if he had made different choices that morning 2 years ago. If he had simply followed Queen Camilla's orders without question, Thomas would have been fired, branded as someone who had violated confidentiality. Emma would have been dealing with a jobless husband just as their first child was about to be born. The financial stress might have destroyed their marriage. Thomas's entire future would have been derailed because he had the misfortune of standing guard during someone else's blackmail attempt. And James would have had to live with knowing he had destroyed his best friend's life to protect his own career. But James had questioned his orders. He had investigated instead of blindly obeying. He had confronted Queen Camilla when it would have been much easier and safer to stay silent. And because he had found the courage to do those things, everything had turned out differently, not just for Thomas and his family, but for Queen Camilla too, who had been freed from years of fear and blackmail. Even Margaret, in an odd way, had been freed from the cycle of attempting revenge and living in bitterness. The audit had shown the truth, and the truth had set everyone free, though perhaps not in the ways Margaret had hoped. James thought about his father and grandfather, both of whom had served the crown with distinction. They had believed in duty and loyalty and following orders. But James hoped they would have understood what he had done and why he had done it. He liked to think his father would have been proud that his son had the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything the family had worked for over 3 generations. Sometimes true loyalty meant protecting people from their own mistakes, even when those people were royalty. Later that afternoon, James passed Queen Camilla in one of the palace corridors. She was on her way to a formal tea with visiting dignitaries, dressed in an elegant blue suit that matched her calm and confident demeanor. When she saw James, she paused briefly and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. It was a tiny gesture that most people would have missed, but James understood what it meant. It was a reminder of what they had been through together, a recognition that sometimes the right path wasn't the easiest one, and gratitude for someone who had cared enough to speak truth to power. That evening, as James drove home to his small house outside London, he thought about the conversation he had had with the new recruits. He wondered if any of them would ever face a situation like the one he had experienced. He hoped not, because those moments were terrifying and uncertain and could end badly as easily as they ended well. But if they did face such situations, James hoped his words would give them the courage to trust their judgment and do what was right. Just as his father's words had given him that courage when he needed it most. James's wife, Rachel, was making dinner when he arrived home. She asked about his day, and he told her about training the new recruits and Thomas's news about the new baby. He didn't mention the memories that had surfaced during the training session, or the brief moment of recognition with Queen Camilla in the corridor. Some things were too personal to share, even with the person he loved most. But Rachel knew him well enough to sense when he was thinking about something deeper than surface conversation. She kissed his cheek and told him she was proud of him, though she didn't specify what she was proud of. She didn't need to. As James settled into his evening routine, he felt a deep sense of contentment that had nothing to do with his promotion or his increased responsibilities. It came from knowing that when he had been tested, when he had faced a choice between easy obedience and difficult integrity, he had chosen right. Not perfect,